Lesson 5 has us still looking at Standard 7, evaluating key political, social, and economic changes that occurred in Georgia from 1877 to 1918. But we're moving into Element B, looking at how rights were denied to African Americans through Jim Crow laws, Plessy versus Ferguson, disenfranchisement, and racial violence. So while you watch, you should take notes or get your tip chart out to refer back to. And you should also be able to respond to the key questions. What key social issues were significant during the New South era? What key political issues affected the development of the state during the New South era? Who were the civil rights activists of this period and how did their views differ? And how did society and politics deny rights to certain individuals and groups during this era? So we'll first take a look at Jim Crow laws. The social and political gains made by African Americans during the 1870s and 1880s began to be chipped away by the white politicians in the 1890s. Laws, called Jim Crow laws, named after a fictional black character, took away most of the citizenship rights of African Americans. Under these laws, most blacks could not vote or serve on juries and were denied many of the other rights of U.S. citizens. After the Supreme Court decision in the Plessy versus Ferguson case, almost every aspect of life was segregated. This included separate schools, sections of public transportation, water fountains, bathrooms, and even separate graveyards and Bibles used to swear on in courts. During this period, intermarriage between the races was strictly forbidden in the southern states, and lynching was used in largely rural areas as a means to enforce the social order of segregation. According to the New Georgia Encyclopedia, between 1882 and 1930, there were 482 African Americans that were lynched in Georgia. That's second only to Mississippi. Though this system also inhibited the economic progress of most African Americans, there were some individuals that rose above this, such as Alonzo Herndon, who fought discrimination and became a successful businessman. He opened the Atlanta Mutual Life Insurance Company in response to white-owned insurance companies' refusal to sell policies to black customers. Others included W.E.B. Du Bois and John and Eugenia Hope Burns. All the same, Jim Crow laws inhibited the educational, economic, and social growth opportunities for most Southerners, both black and white. Plessy versus Ferguson. On June 2, 1892, Homer Plessy was arrested in Louisiana for sitting in the whites-only section of a rail car. In this planned protest, Plessy, who was one-eighth black and could pass for white, identified himself as a black man. This orchestrated event was planned by the Committee of Citizens, a group of well-educated African Americans who wanted to test Louisiana's segregation laws. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where the court ruled in favor of Louisiana, and based on the separate but equal doctrine. The court determined that under the Constitution, the 14th and 15th Amendments, blacks had political rights, but social rights were not required. According to the court, as long as facilities were equal for both races, then they could be separate. Upon this ruling, most southern states, including Georgia, separated all aspects of life. This included separate theaters and movie houses, rail and street cars, and separate bathrooms. Those separate facilities were most certainly not equal. For example, according to the New Georgia Encyclopedia, the average white school in the state of Georgia spent about $43 per student in 1930, in comparison to $10 per student in all black schools. Just in case you were curious, after the Plessy versus Ferguson court case, Homer Plessy, who was a shoemaker, was born in 1862 and died in 1925. After the case, he remained in New Orleans, where he stayed active in his community and his church. He became a salesman for the People's Life Insurance Company for the remainder of his life. The 14th and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution, which guaranteed citizenship rights to all African Americans and voting rights to African American men, were ratified by the U.S. Congress and included the votes of the Southern states. However, during the Jim Crow era, most blacks in the South lost these voting rights due to the lack of enforcement by the federal government. The Southern states, including Georgia, established many laws that prevented blacks and poor whites, for that matter, from voting. These laws led to black disenfranchisement that led to disenfranchisement in Georgia included poll taxes, which were taxes on voting. Most poor blacks and many poor whites could not pay this tax and were unable to vote. In some cases, the poll was waived for poor whites. Another form of disenfranchisement was the white primary. Due to the fact that the dominant party in Georgia was the Democratic Party, most of the major decisions took place during the primary. The white primary did not allow African Americans to vote in these all-important elections, and this was in 1900. The poll taxes were in 1877. The literacy test began in 1908. This was used to prevent African Americans from voting as well. Due to the substandard education in the South for both poor blacks and whites, many Georgians could not read or write and could not pass these tests in order to vote. Some whites were passed by polling officials to allow them to vote, though others were not. However, many educated blacks were told that they still failed the test and were unable to vote. There's a famous folk tale that is told about a Harvard educated black man in Mississippi who was given the literacy test in English, German, and French, and he passed all three. Finally, he was given the test in Mandarin Chinese, and when he was asked, "What does this say?" the man was disgusted at this point and said, "It says that you don't want me to vote." A fourth means of disenfranchisement was the grandfather clause, and this was from 1890 to 1910. This was used to allow some poor white citizens the opportunity to vote while continuing to deny the rights to blacks. These laws usually said that if a person's father was able to vote before the Civil War, then they could vote too without paying a poll tax or without taking the literacy test. The law in some states said that if a person's grandfather fought in the Civil War, then they could vote as well. So what we see coming from this time period is lots of racial violence. The racial violence was rampant during the New South era. As mentioned previously, the 1906 Atlanta race riot was one of the largest demonstrations of this violence, along with over 400 lynchings that happened in the state from 1880 to 1930. These lynchings were often orchestrated by members of the KKK, who, during this time period, consisted of teachers, policemen, ministers, and other community leaders. As in the case of Leo Frank, men in the upper class of Marietta society were responsible for his lynching, which included a judge and, according to some reports, a former governor. Some of the most famous Georgians during this time supported racial violence and lynching, including Tom Watson and Rebecca Latimer Felton. For more information about Jim Crow laws and Plessy versus Ferguson and disenfranchisement and racial violence in Georgia, you'll need to check out the that are attached to this lesson on Google Classroom, and you can always visit the New Georgia Encyclopedia to search. So, now that you're done, you've got several key questions that you should be able to add to, but in bold you'll see the question, how did society and politics deny rights to certain individuals and groups during this era? You should really be able to give a good, thorough answer to that after this lesson.